Okay, so we were talking about sacred literature. I wanted to talk as well about the canon of Scripture, and it goes back to the concept of authority that we were talking about earlier. So what does canon mean, right? C-A-N-O-N, all right? It comes from the Greek word kanonikos, which means rule or measure. It's basically the measure by which we determine what is to be incorporated into those books that are the Bible. Okay. So I mentioned earlier that the canon of the New Testament was not put together formally or officially by the church until the latter part of the 4th century. So think about that from historical terms. You know, the church was operating for over 300 years before the New Testament was formalized. Okay? And it was formalized across 3 or 4 different councils during the 4th century. So you had the Council of Nicaea, which was actually in 325. Right? So the church was really freed to be itself with the Edict of Milan, which was Constantine's freeing of the church a few years prior to the Council of Nicaea. And that allowed the church to finally start to wrestle with some of the questions that had been brewing that really couldn't be addressed in public because of the persecution of the Roman Empire. So you had the Council of Nicaea in the year 325. You had the Council of Hippo, which was in 393. You had the Council of Carthage. Now, Hippo is in North Africa. That's where St. Augustine actually lived, in Hippo. Carthage, which was also in North Africa, that was 397, and also in 419. And all of this was reaffirmed during the Council of Trent in 1545. It actually ended in 1563. The Council of Trent was convened following the Reformation to answer the questions of the Reformation. And one of the questions that came up with the Reformation was, what is the canon of Scripture? And why should the canon of Scripture be what it is? So, you know, what's funny is that a few years ago, there was an author, Elaine Pagels. I don't know if any of you have heard of her, but she came out with a book called The Gnostic Gospels. And she was basically saying, oh, look what we've just discovered, you know, lying in the desert, you know, all these Gospels that were hidden by the evil patriarchal Catholic Church, and, you know, why didn't they, you know, allow for these Gospels to be included because they should be, etc., etc., etc. So I'm going to turn to Eusebius, who was around in the 4th century, and he wrote the first, to our knowledge, comprehensive history of the church around the time of the Council of Nicaea, around 325 AD. So this is about 1700 years old, and he talks about the canon of Scripture as it was accepted in the 4th century. And he says, it will be well at this point to classify the New Testament writings already referred to. We must, of course, put first the holy quartet of the Gospels, followed by the Acts of the Apostles. The next place on the list goes to Paul's epistles, and after them we must recognize the epistle called 1 John, likewise 1 Peter. To these may be added, if it is thought proper, the revelation of John, the arguments about which I shall set out when the time comes. These are classed as recognized books. Now, who recognized those books? Right? The church. Right? It wasn't a group of itinerant preachers that got together here or there and just independently decided, you know, I'm gonna recognize this, that, or the other. It was the church. Those that are disputed yet familiar to most include the epistles known as James, Jude, and 2 Peter, and those called 2nd and 3rd John, the work either of the evangelist or of someone else with the same name. And then he talks about spurious books, books that were scandalous, basically, or thought to be. Among spurious books must be placed the Acts of Paul, the shepherd, and the Revelation of Peter, also called the Epistle of Barnabas, and the teachings of the apostles, together with the Revelation of John, if this seems the right place for it. As I said before, some reject it, others included among the recognized books. Moreover, some have found a place in the list for the Gospel of Hebrews, a book which has a special appeal for the Hebrews who have accepted Christ. Those would all be classed with the disputed books. All right, and then he goes on and he basically says, there's a different category that are not canonical but disputed, yet are familiar to most churchmen. For we must not confuse these with the writings published by heretics under the name of the apostles as containing either the Gospels of Peter, Thomas, Matthias, and several other books. So basically the books that Elaine Pagels was suggesting should be included 1,700 years earlier had been disputed by the church at that time to be non-canonical and spurious and heretical or whatever other pejorative word you want to attach to it. And the point is that the church just didn't stumble upon this. What caused the canon to be what it is that the books that were there had to be apostolic. They were basically, written by the apostles, or Paul is considered an apostle, and they were used basically during the Mass. So the Mass was a big part of the incorporation of canonicity. Yes.
You keep referring to the church. Who is the church at that time?
The church is the Pope and the bishops in communion. So when
he was seated at that time.
Right. So when the church held a council, they said, "Okay, guys, let's all meet in Nicaea and decide what's canonical." And it took them another 100 years to come to conclusions on books like Revelation and things like that. So there was dispute among the bishops as to whether, should we include this, should we not include this? Okay? And it's the concept of authority in the magisterium that ultimately wind up determining what was included. So, if you notice, most of you probably know this, there are more books in the Catholic canon than there are in the Protestant canon. Right? So there are 73 books in the Old Testament Catholic canon, and there are only 66 in the Protestant version. Okay? Anyone know why that is? You're not allowed to answer. It's a bit of a longer explanation, but I'll try to make it short. All right. A lot of folks, and I've heard this over and over and over again, is why did the Catholics put these books in there? Okay? It's not that the Catholics put those books in there; it's that the Protestants removed them. The canon that was used for the Old Testament by the apostles themselves was actually the Greek canon known as the Septuagint. Okay? Septuagint. So you think about the Jews of Jesus' day. Okay, they're kind of like Jews that are in places like New York today. Okay, they don't necessarily speak Hebrew in their daily life, right? They were speaking at that time, oftentimes Greek as a first language, right? So you look at Philip, for example. He came from the part of Galilee. The Decapolis area, 10 cities area, that was really a Greek place, which is why whenever you see the Greeks being brought to Jesus in the New Testament, it's usually by Philip, because Philip was the native Greek speaker. Okay? But the Septuagint was basically the Old Testament in Greek, right? Alexander the Great had invaded and had conquered Judea and Samaria and all that area hundreds of years prior. And before the Romans. And it had established a Greek mind, if you will, with the Jews. And then there were a lot of Jews that left that part of the world to go and trade in places like Alexandria or Rome or Tarsus, where Paul was from. And they trafficked in Greek. They didn't traffic in the Hebrew. Okay? So what happened was that after the fall of the temple in AD 70, the Jews went through kind of a woe is me moment, right? And they sat around and they said, well, what has caused this to happen to us? Why is God, punishing us this way? And over the course of, the 2nd century, they basically determined that they needed to get back to basics. And one of the ways that they wanted to get back to basics was to slough off some of those things that they determined to be bad influences, like all these Greek influences that were infiltrating their sacred liturgy and all the other things that were there. So they went back to a Hebrew canon. Those 7 books that are in the Old Testament that were in the Septuagint were not included, in part because they were originally written in Greek. Okay? So they looked at those as of questionable authority. And the Hebrew canon was then incorporated without those books. But you got to remember that the Christian church, the Catholic Church, had been established 100 years before they came to this decision. So we didn't need their permission to keep these books as part of our canon. We'd already determined through liturgy that they were canonical. And the church later reaffirmed that in the 4th century. It wasn't like they had to go back to the Jews and say, hey, do you mind if we include these? Okay. So what happened was that over the course of the next, few hundred years, St. Jerome created a notation in his Bible that, hey, I noticed that the Hebrew canon does not include these, but okay, let's move along. And he translated the Bible from Hebrew and Greek into Latin, the Vulgate Bible. Martin Luther comes along, and Martin Luther finds that several of those books don't jive with his theology in part, and also he looked at the Hebrew canon and he said, okay, why is this missing? And you got to imagine, it's the 16th century. We have a hard enough time in the internet age getting proper information. How many of you have been duped by Snopes or some other, thing on the internet? Imagine what it was in the 16th century, where all of the knowledge that you had was in the local monastery, and you had to ply through 1,000 books to get whatever it is that you wanted to get. So it's quite possible Luther had no idea, and he was just basically saying, okay, I question the authority here of the church to put these books in here, but he removed them in part because some of the stuff in those books, like praying for the dead in Maccabees, didn't square with his theology regarding purgatory. He didn't believe that there was a purgatory, so he said, okay, well that doesn't help my argument at all, let's go ahead and remove that. In fact, he wanted to remove Revelation, he wanted to remove James, he wanted to remove parts of the other books that were out there as well, and his lieutenants, like Melanchthon, basically said, no, you're not going to do that. Okay. So,
and when Christ quotes scripture, he oftentimes uses the Septuagint.
Yes.
When he's referring to it. So he's actually using that version in the Greek when he quotes the Old Testament scripture. So it shows the authority he was using of that at the time.
Yes, that's true. So 19th century comes along. There was a thing called the Bible Tract Society. They printed a lot of free Bibles here in the United States, but the condition that you would get a free Bible is that it didn't include that in the canon. So the Protestants came to accept a canon of Scripture without it. But if you go back to the original King James Bible of 1611, it included it, right? So it took a few hundred years for Protestants to weed those books out of their canon. And what the point is that it was there to begin with, okay? All right, so the Testaments, right? We've got the New and the Old Testament. Allison mentioned earlier that it's a seamless thing in the sense that the Old, the New is hidden in the Old, and the, or
Old is revealed.
Reverse that, right? So the Old is revealed in the New, right? And the Old prefigures typologically what happens in the New Testament. Okay, so Scripture basically is God's story. Okay. But we want to talk. We want to talk about typology as well. So I'm going to mention this, and it's actually going to be more incorporated into what we talk about next week. But we talk about types and typology, and this goes back to the Old and the New Testament thing. Okay. So typology is the study of types. When we talk about the New revealing the Old. Right, so Jesus is a figure, if you will, of a lot of Old Testament figures that came before him. So you think about someone like Moses, for example. Right, what did Moses do? Moses led people out of slavery. Okay, but the slavery that he led them out of was a physical slavery. The slavery that Jesus leads people out of is a spiritual slavery. So in that sense, Moses can be considered a type of Jesus. Okay. Eve, right, can be considered a type of Mary in the sense that, through Eve came the birthing of the human race. And when we think about the church and the birthing of the church, as Mary is the mother of Jesus and Jesus is our spiritual brother, then by extension Mary is our spiritual mother. Okay? So that's just a couple of examples of types. Again, we'll get into that in further detail next week. All right, so almost getting there, guys. How are we doing on time? Give me 5 more minutes on this, okay? So the senses of Scripture, okay? How do we go through the senses of Scripture to understand what's being done or said in anything that we're reading, Okay, so there are two main senses of Scripture. One is the literal, and we talked about that to some extent earlier. The other is spiritual. Okay, and under spiritual you have basically three headings. You have allegorical, moral, and the difficult word here, anagogical. Okay, so literal sense, what is the author literally saying? And the process that the church, the word that's used to describe all of this is called exegesis. And that's the process for determining what's being said in any scripture. Okay, so following the rules of sound interpretation. Okay, one more example on literal versus literalist. We don't want to be literalists when we interpret scripture. If I say it's raining cats and dogs, okay, and I put that in a box, and 1,000 years from now somebody finds it and they open it up and it says, oh, it must have been literally raining cats and dogs. Is that what I was saying? No. So we don't want to be literalists. We want to understand the meaning of the passage. All right? What would be easier to do? To interpret a sentence or an entire book? Anyone?
A book?
Well, you would think a sentence, though, right? Because it's much smaller, right? If you're trying to interpret a whole book, you've got reams and reams and reams of sentences. But if I were to say a simple sentence like, I never said you stole my money. Okay? What am I saying? Right? There's so many places where you can come up with a different interpretation of this. And this is the problem that we have when people say, hey, the Bible's just going to inspire me. It's going to help me get to truth just by simply looking at the words and knowing what's being said. Okay? You can change any word in that sentence and come up with a different meaning. Okay? Maybe I never said you stole my money, but Allison said you stole my money. Okay? I never said you stole my money. I thought it, though. Okay? I never said you stole my money. I said you stole my horse. Okay? I never said you stole my money. I said you stole Tom's money. Okay? Those are the different ways that you can come up with all this stuff, and it requires a legitimate authority to come to a conclusion there. And this is the problem with Bible alone, absent authority. You wind up going in 30,000 different directions. Okay? All right, so allegorical. What are we saying there? Okay? How does the literal text relate to Jesus and his divine plan? Okay? So, example. They built a temple. What could be an allegory for they built a temple? Literal sense is they built a temple. But what's an allegorical sense of they built a temple? Anybody? How about Jesus was the temple? Okay, he says, destroy this temple and in 3 days I will raise it up again. Okay, that's an allegorical sense of they built a temple. The crossing of the Red Sea. Okay, literally they crossed the Red Sea. An allegory of the crossing of the Red Sea is, again, something like Jesus leading us out of the slavery or bondage of spiritual slavery. Okay? It's an allegory of the crossing of the Red Sea. Or, in a sense, it also prefigures baptism. So it can be an allegory for baptism. Okay? The moral sense. Moral, it's pretty straightforward, right? How does this scripture apply to me in terms of how I should live my life? Okay, what is St. Paul saying in that particular passage, and how does that impact what I'm supposed to do? So if I say they built a temple, basically your body is a temple. Okay, so don't destroy your body with drugs or drink or those kinds of things. Okay, that's a moral interpretation of that. Anagogical. In Greek that means leading. What does it lead us to? Okay, it leads us to some future revelation. Okay. The temple. Okay? They built a temple. Well, in the book of Revelation, it talks about a temple, a new Jerusalem, basically. You know, the descent of God and man and the creation of a new heaven and a new earth. So that's a way of looking at that passage and seeing something prefigured in that passage towards something that is going to happen in the future. Right? Another example might be the wedding at Cana, okay, where that marriage of the woman and the man represents the marriage of the woman and the man in the Garden of Eden. When they run out of wine, it's kind of like mankind running out of grace. Right? So, oh my gosh, the grace is gone. What happens? The woman intercedes for mankind to restore mankind's grace through the action of her son. Okay? But then we look at the book of Revelation. Right? Cool thing about Scripture, it's bookended by marriage on both ends. Right? Starts with marriage, ends with marriage. The final scene in the book of Revelation is about the wedding feast of the Lamb. And the wedding feast of the Lamb is when Jesus is married to his church. Right? The bride is the church. We are all part of that marriage feast in that leading anagogical sense of the meaning there. All right. We're going to leave some time to talk about this. I do have some handouts for you guys. And any questions on this, please. Go ahead.
And tell me if this is helpful. You talked earlier about distinguishing between the literal sense and the literalistic interpretation of it. And what we want to say, when we talked earlier about Scripture being inerrant, meaning that it cannot err, it always teaches the truth, never falsehood, it leads us in all of these senses, right? So both the literal and the spiritual sense. But what I want to bring up here was like, for example, would you say that a literalistic interpretation would be that God created the sun and moon on the fourth day, meaning there were 4 times that the earth rotated with respect to the sun, and then on the fourth day God created the sun? We run into a problem there for interpreting it literalistically.
Well, go ahead. I'm sorry. Finish.
A literal sense would be God created everything, including the sun and the moon and the stars. God created all things, and that they were good, and they are for. And if you go through the whole thing, there is something literal that's being presented there in this poetic narrative.
Yes.
And that's what, and those are the literal truths of Scripture. But then there are also the allegorical, the moral, and the anagogical. You take the moral would be, well, God made all things good, right?
But here's an interesting anecdote with respect to the 24 hours, right, or the 7 days.
Right.
Okay, if you apply relativity and time as a relative thing, okay, and there's a Jewish MIT professor that went through this exercise. They basically said, okay, if we take all the mass of the known universe and redirect it back into a singularity, that point at which the universe was created, okay, and you apply relativity to that moment. If you were a human being standing outside of that moment, from the time of the Big Bang until the advent of man, relative to you, the amount of time that would elapse would be about 7 days.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Right?
Wow.
So, I don't know.
Yeah, there's an interesting
Maybe.
But that's the beauty of our church, is it allows you to have open interpretation. You don't have to be literalistic. You can't. There could be theories that elapse that, but as long as you understand it in these senses, not literalistically as far as it has to be that way.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
All right, so I was going to go into this, but I won't for time's sake. This is basically, and I printed 20 copies. I don't know if that's enough. But it's basically where you will find Scripture in every part of the Mass. Okay, so I don't know if you guys want to pass that along. This is basically a breakdown of every book of the Bible, just a quick summary of sort of an update as to what is going on in that particular book. Okay. This is a recommended reading list. Okay, the books that I have out front are over there. Again, you can go out to Amazon or someplace and check that out.
And have that done by next week.
And have it all done by next week. Now this, I will issue a caveat as I hand this out to you, okay? This is actually something that we were using 10 years ago at the Cathedral of Christ the King. And it is basically it's not comprehensive, nothing can be, but it's a list of themes that run through the Catholic Church and the Bible. So in other words, the concept of church, the concept of the church must be one, the primacy of Peter, those kinds of things. It's kind of an apologetics document, but I would caution all of you in that as I've grown in my own faith and wisdom with respect to apologetics, don't get into beating people about the head and shoulders with Scripture and verse, because it can be really counterproductive, and quite honestly, the devil himself can use Scripture and verse to come to a conclusion if he wants to. So that's it. Any questions that you guys want to put forward or discussion? James, how would you like to?
If anybody has any questions, anything to clear up, or something that wasn't clear, it's very helpful to everybody. Just to have a clarification, or just something to comment on at this point.
Clarification on the word apologetics.
Sure.
Use a lot I don't understand.
So to engage in apologetics is to make a defense of something. It's not to apologize for something. It's to basically say, here's what the church teaches and why. And it's one thing to know the what, it's another thing to know the why. And, too often we either know, we only know the what, if we know anything at all. Apologetics is that exercise of discourse with someone to explain the why of why you do something.
That's very helpful.
Any other questions? Wonderful. As we were saying earlier, we went through a lot today. Great class. Thank you very much, Bill. All right.